Let's start. I think let's start with the introduction of Ryan. And a lot of people know me. First of all, well, let me start with me, which I'm the founder of Stellar Peers, and we have these meetings usually on Tuesdays where we solve problems together from time to time. We also have guests like we're having tonight, and the whole purpose of these meetups are to solve problems together, learn from people, learn from each other, support each other. And with that, I'm going to introduce Ryan Borker. So Ryan is an experienced PM. He comes from Axiom, and before that he was at Gigster. And before that, when he started, he was at BCG, which is one of the top consulting companies in the world. Ryan has a lot of experience with these problems, and I think his background is fantastic. So I asked Ryan if he would come today to actually show how to do this estimation problem, which is quite hard, to tell you the truth. It's unlike other estimation problems that we encounter. And most of the estimation problems are top down, and then you go bottoms up. This one requires a little bit of creativity. So I think, Ryan, I will leave it up to you, give you the floor, and please start telling us how you solve estimation problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Melina. And I just wanted to thank you again for creating the community of Stellar Peers. I've had a great time prepping for all of my product interviews here. And thanks to everyone in the community, including the people who have interviewed me here or who will be interviewing in the future. You guys are doing something great, part of something special. So happy to, in a very small way, hopefully contribute something back to the community. So as Melina mentioned, I actually spent some time at BCG and spent a lot of time interviewing people on case questions and case interviews. So have some experience in dealing with these problems. And Melina, she actually signed up for one of my interviews and said, I don't want you to interview me, but rather I want to give you another interview problem and see if you can solve this as quickly as possible. So I came up with something that I'm going to share tonight. I'm going to share it with very, very minor modifications. The math is probably still not correct. Some of you will probably go through and fix my math or whatever it is. But I think the more important thing is the approach, and we can debug it together. So this can be a collaborative exercise. So Melina, how would you like to go through this?
Yeah, so I would like to be your interviewer. Pretend that you are in the interview. And you just do it the way that you would do it in a real scenario.
Okay.
Asking me questions, and I can ask you questions and so on. And I think if people, have questions at the moment, they should jump in and ask Ryan, so that the moment is not lost. Does that sound good?
That sounds great.
All right. So I'm gonna pretend, that you are at a Google PM interview. Say, welcome, Ryan.
Thanks, Melina.
And we have a question for you. We would like you to estimate what is the number of commercial airports in the United States.
Gotcha. So you're talking about places where you can buy and sell, or you can buy tickets to go fly there on, something like a Spirit or a American or a United Airlines, correct?
Yes, and for just regular people, you and me, not like a business airport where they take packages or things like that. Just where people go and buy a ticket.
All right, perfect. Yeah, so this is awesome. I actually worked in airlines at BCG, and so I have some industry knowledge that I hopefully will bring here. But what I'd like to do first is bound the problem. And I know for a fact, or I don't know for a fact, but I'm going to go ahead and estimate that, roughly, at the low end, there's an airport for, you can begin to get a commercial airport when there's 100,000 people in a city or in an area. And so, to think about the possible upper bound of this, you might say, hey, there's, 325 million people in the US. If you divide that by 100K, you've got something like, 32, 50 airports. Now that's a very large amount of airports there, but that's our upper limit.
Um,
And the way.
So Ryan, before you continue, I would like to know, how do you make that assessment of about 100K people? There's an airport. There seems to be a best practice apparently about building airports for 100K people. Is that correct? Is my assessment right?
Yeah, I think, this is just based on my personal experience. I happen to know that I grew up in a town called Sugar Land, Texas. And when I was growing up there, there was no airport, there was no commercial airport. It was about 40,000 people. And recently, I'm actually going back there this Thursday. I'm not flying into the Sugar Land airport, but there is a commercial regional airport, and the population is close to 100,000. So I'm not saying that, it's a hard and fast rule. But in my experience, I can't think of an airport that I've flown into, and I've traveled a lot with PCG, where there's been less than 100,000 people. And even as you think about the smaller resorts near ski mountains, there tends to be like pretty big population centers that build up before they kind of get served with commercial airports.
Now, let me stop here, and I'm going to get out of my interviewer hat. And I'm going to ask you a question just for us, which is, let's say that, hey, I haven't had the experience that you had. I probably don't know very well, in general, I don't have a sense for it, right? 100K people. How would you recommend somebody like me or somebody that doesn't have had that experience that you had in trying to come up with this number of 100K?
Yeah, I would think, again, I think the goal and the overall structure of this problem that you'll see, and I'm getting a little bit of feedback in case someone's not on mute, just to provide that to the group there. But
people put their mute their microphones, please. Thank you. Unless you ask a question, of course. Okay.
Yeah, so I think that what I'm trying to do and the way that I approached this problem was really you're never going to get it perfect. In any estimation problem, I take the kind of Fermi estimation approach where you're just trying to get as close as possible and get within the range. And so what you'll want to do is kind of put error bars on either side of the problem and sort of get there. Now, the way to get to the high end is actually, it'll be pretty simple. You can think of the biggest city, of course, and the sort of number of airports they have, so there are at least, if you think about that, like there's at least one or two airports in New York. But on the lower bound, what we did with Sugar Land here is think about the smallest airport that you know of. Where is it? And what is the rough population? And so it doesn't really matter whether you're in Colombia or, India or, anywhere in the United States. You probably know of a relatively small town. And if you think about this, let's say, hey, the town is 300,000, and that's starting to become like a reasonable sized city. You're still kind of dividing this in and getting, a reasonable high bound, as we'll find out, for the number of airports. So I don't think it matters that you have this specific experience so much as you're thinking about the smallest airport that you've been to kind of create that, upper bound on the number of airports.
So let's continue with it. Yeah.
Okay, great. So we have an upper bound here, and then what we'd really like to find is there clearly are not 3,250 airports, because the population is not divided in chunks of 100,000 people. In fact, we know that the population is divided into some very large cities, into some very small cities. And what I'd like to do is say, okay, well, what is the number of cities that have over 100,000 people, and how can we estimate that? And therefore, how can we actually estimate the number, sort of a number of airports? And then what I'd like to do after that is sense check, just figure out, we'll come up with a number and then see whether it's reasonable, test it in our minds to try and see if we can get something better. So,
I'm sorry. Hey.
Yeah.
So this is Paula, but I have a conceptual question, I think. Why these kind of questions could be important on an interview? I mean, how many airports do we have in the United States?
Yeah.
Why is this important?
Yeah, I can answer that very quickly. So in general, in product management, when you are at the job, especially when you are going to talk about new initiatives and how much money you want to basically request money to invest in that initiative, you have to estimate the market size or things like that for whatever product that you're making. And when you're talking to an executive or a team of people, you have to do these calculations quickly, like ballpark numbers. And so estimation is a really important. Having the ability to estimate the size of a market or anything like that is really critical for a product manager to be able to convince somebody, to the executives or the company, to give them money to invest in something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, total sense. Thank you.
Hey, this is Simen. I really like the fact that the initial idea of demarcating the definition of a commercial airport was called out. But should we think about all the dimensions that can define a commercial airport? Like, let's say, Virgin Islands don't have population, but they're still airports, right? So I think the tourist destinations have lower density, can also be commercial airports with high traffic, though population can be less. So should we think about all these dimensions when we define the definition of a commercial airport, or do you suggest otherwise?
Yeah, I can take that one. Again, I think that on the whole, unless there are some airports that will have low population and high and still have commercial airports, those tend to be the exceptions rather than the rule. If you think about Hawaii, for example, if you have a lot of people, or even these airports like Eagle in outside of Denver or Vail, they tend to have population surges in the in-season that probably take them above that threshold. And I would say that the vast majority of the traffic is between cities. And so I think you could absolutely go down that path, but I think for the way that I approached this was, what is the quickest way to get to a reasonable answer, not what is the most comprehensive way to think about it. And anytime you can take a step to kind of simplify and it not be a step that's going to, drastically throw off your answer by an order of magnitude, I would try and take that step. I'd recommend you take that step, because what you're going to do otherwise is complicate your answer and maybe not get additional accuracy.
Wonderful.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right.
Shall we continue?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So, the way that I thought about it, again, population isn't evenly distributed. And I think, in fact, there actually are no regulations on population. And for things that there aren't regulation on sort of usage or population, words, cities, hit songs, they actually tend to follow a power law distribution. And so what I'd like to do is figure out if we can get from, 100,000 and some power law here to figure out, how many cities are in each, category. And so what I'd like to do here is say, multiply by a power of 5 rather than a power of 10. The reason that will become apparent. Actually, I'm doing this on the wrong axis here. I already labeled it. Sorry. So you've got, 12.5. That's roughly the New York metro area. Out of that, after that, you've got about 2.5, and then you've got, 500K, and then there's some threshold 100K. And when we think about the distribution, it's going to look a little bit of something like this. And again, we care about, the number of cities here. We know for New York up here, there's one city there. And then I'm just going to assume that, again, it follows a sort of exponent of 10 here. So as we go here, this is roughly 100, and this is roughly 1,000. So it's a log style graph here. And this is inclusive here, so we don't need to sum these up. So here, again, we have 1,000 cities with traffic out of them, and that's actually that's our first pass answer at the number of airports. It's on the order of 1,000.
Ryan, I understand your log estimate on the number of cities. So you're going 10 cities are going to be highly populated. One is very high. 10 are semi-high, 100, and so on. But the left-hand side of the population, how do you determine those numbers?
So like I said, we know that, and this is a little bit of magic, consulting magic. What I did was worse math than the first time, because I know that the most populated city and metro area in the U.S. is New York. Depending on if you say the city itself, it's probably 9 million. If you think about the metro area, it's probably 12 to 13. And then I wanted to make it a little bit smoother to get to 100K, which is our lower bound here. It's like if you are lower than 100K, you don't have an airport. And so what's the sort of nice increments that you could have a log graph? What I had done originally was 100, 500, 1 million, and 10 million.
Right.
But you find out if you actually multiply by 5, which you can kind of change, you could change the coefficients or whatever on the equation, you get a slightly smoother math graph, and it actually puts well at the bottom, where we know that the bottom part of this is where the minimum we're going to see a city have an airport, and at the top is the most populated city in the U.S.
How do you justify your estimate on the y-axis? Because I understand the fact that you want to make it smoother, but they're probably going to ask you.
Yeah. So here for example, so we know this is correct, right? We know we can actually know that this is like actually not far from inaccurate. So if you look,
the top one could be New York. The one below.
And then the one below is like Chicago, LA, Houston, Dallas, the Phoenix metro area. And if you look at the top 10 cities, I think this number is probably actually closer to 1.5 million. But again, for the sake of our argument, the top 10 cities are still roughly on that order of magnitude. And so I would not worry about sort of missing that too much.
Okay.
If you really wanted, again, you could really think about a different function here. But again, my goal here is to help you solve this as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
If you want to start fixing, you could say, okay, how many cities do I know in the U.S. that have more than 1 million people or 2.5 million people? This number is probably like 6. This number is probably like 10. But roughly it's the same. And if you were to scale this again, let's just say we say this is 6 and then 36. You actually get some sensitivity there. But I think you can also solve that sensitivity through the next step in my sense check, which is why I don't want to spend too much time on this. I think the power law is actually a very good distribution of cities. It actually turns out to be true because there's nothing restricting movement in and out of cities.
So could you put your numbers again on the power 10, on the log number 10, so that it's clear?
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
So
Okay,
we've got 1, 10, 100, and 1,000, and this is cumulative here, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So do we have a question, or should I keep going?
Keep going. That's
okay. Excellent. So now we've gone down from 3,200 airports to roughly 1,000, and now I think about it. Are there 20 airports in each state? So if we divide by 50, 20 airports actually seems like quite a lot. So why one way to think about this is then again to say, okay, what do I know about airports? And I know in these cities, these top 10 cities, they roughly have about 2 airports each. These are the top 20 airports. And I happen to know from industry, and this is again a little bit of a trick, that a vast majority of the flight miles are out of the top 20 or 30 airports. So now I take 1,000 destinations and think about it from an airport perspective. If I go to an airport, if I go to Houston, if I go to San Francisco, if I go to New York, and I can go to 1,000 airports, and let's say each one of these can serve, equally a certain number of distributed. Each one of these can serve unique destinations. Then each airport would need to serve 50 people. And I do a sense check there, and I think about it, and I say, well, that doesn't seem totally unreasonable that I could go to 50 destinations. If I think about looking at the screen at SFO or looking at the screen at JFK, I can imagine 50 cities up there. But then I think harder, and I'm like, well, actually, there's a couple things that make me pause. One is some of these 50 cities are going to be repeats, and secondly, some of these cities are going to be, potentially international. I'm going to ignore the international part of it for right now, but let me think about the repeat cities. What do we know right now about the airline structure in the US and actually the airline structure in the world? It actually has a hub and spoke system where most of your flights go through a hub. So if I think about, these 50 destinations, then at the top 20 airports, I'm actually, a lot of these flights, and I would say at the very least, it's a reasonable assumption that these 20 hubs are going to be connected to each other. So now, instead of having 50 unique destinations that I can go to, 20 of these destinations at these top 20 airports are actually going to be 2 other hubs. And it's technically 19, but let's just simplify the math here. And now we're going to say there are 30 unique destinations across the top 20 regional or top 20 airports in the US. And so if we assume that all of the unique destinations are served by one of the top 20 hubs in the US, which I think is a reasonable assumption, I can't think of the point-to-point model is very, very limited in scope in terms of airline miles. And most of the flights that I've ever taken where I've had to go to a random airport involve me taking a big plane to a place like Dallas and then taking a small plane to the smaller destination.
Yeah.
And so what I'm going to suggest is actually each of these 20 only have 30 unique destinations, which will get me to an estimate of 600 commercial airline airports in the US.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that's where I'm going to stop and see if anyone has any questions, because I went through that relatively quickly.
I have one, starting with the 1,000. So the 1,000 is your 1,000 cities, is that correct? And you're saying
Yes.
Of those 1,000 cities, there are 20 that have big hubs, right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
you're saying, okay, so those big hubs, they probably are connected between each other. So you are discounting the 20, and they probably can go to 30 other cities.
Yep.
So that's about 600 airports, basically.
Right.
And that is sort of like your, so that, let me just think for a moment, that is a lower bound, or?
That is actually my estimate. So I think that's my estimate for the number of airports. And I think we could further refine it. But what I've done, again, I've made a couple of assumptions that narrow it down. So we said 1,000 here is now a more reasonable upper bound. Can we get more precise? Can we actually figure out whether that makes sense or not? And I thought about it, and I said, okay, I know something about the airline structure. I know that the industry structure is hub and spoke. I know that the top 20, and again, if you're not familiar with airlines in the US, you could make different assumptions here and still arrive at a sort of a reasonable answer. And you could say, okay, well, I know that there are 4 or 5 major carriers. Each of them have 2 or 3 hubs or 4 hubs. I would say that I think about Southwest, I think about United, I think about American, I think about Delta. You maybe add JetBlue in there. I know for United, I'm a lifelong United flyer, but I know they have hubs in Chicago, New York, Houston, Denver, San Francisco. So that's 5 hubs. So you can say, okay, well, there's 5 hubs for 5 major airlines. Some of them will overlap, or 4 hubs. So you can just get to your number however you want to do that. I just happen to have done a case in the airline industry where I know that the top 20 airports account disproportionately. It's like, again, a similar power law, disproportionately for the flight miles.
And here,
Go ahead.
you're not counting you counted 1,000, but how about the 100 and the 10 on your x-axis?
Yeah, so this is cumulative.
I see.
So as you go over here, this is cumulative. The New York has 12.5 million people. That city still has more than 100,000 people. So it's inclusive. Initially, you might think you need to sum these up, but this is actually just the number. And so if you're adding all of the cities greater than 100K, you're by definition going to include the 500K, 2.5 million, and 12.5 million cities.
Specific. I would have imagined that would be specific, not cumulative. Why do you think it's greater? Why? I'm trying to understand. So I thought that it was 12. There are 10 cities that have 12.5 million people. There are 100 cities that have 500K. So could you explain again why the 1,000 include all of them? Because the 500K and the 12.5.
Yeah. So my understanding is if you're a city with 500K people in it, you are by definition a city with 100K people. I don't think this would. I think So I'm just counting those cities. I think if you did it the other way and you summed them, you would actually be double counting, is my understanding of it.
Nice.
So initially I had thought the same way you did, and we end up with 1,111. But I thought about that again, and say if I'm estimating that there's 1,000 100K cities, why would I then add the city of New York, which is a 100K city, which must be included in that first number?
Yeah. Okay, got it.
So quick question, this is Sumit. How do you take the 30 out and considering 20 unique always be overlapping in every set?
Yeah, that's just an assumption. It's not a great assumption, but I think that the assumption that I made, and I actually should have clarified this, was that hubs are connected, that you will always be able to fly from hub to hub. And again, this is meant for speed, not for, intense scrutiny. So the smart observer would say that actually, no, 3 of these, LaGuardia has 3 airports and you can't take a flight actually from Newark to JFK. That's not a great assumption. But again, I don't think, that's something that you can call out, but I don't think it necessarily changes the answer. If you kind of decrease this to 15, for example, it doesn't, it's the process that gets you relatively close. And again, I didn't know the number of commercial airports in the US before doing this. And so I think the goal is to really get sort of on the right order of the number of airports. So the right order of magnitude is really what you're going for, and having a solid logic behind it.
And Ryan, so here 600 is the maximum, correct?
Yes.
And how about the minimum, or trying to get a sense for whether this is a reasonable number? Can you do a check, a sanity check?
Yeah, I mean, you could do a sanity check. So the way that I think about it is, let's divide it by 50 states. So a couple of ways you could do it. Divide it by 50 states. So you get 12 airports per state. This is going to definitely be high in some places. It's actually going to be low in other places.
Right.
So it gives you a sense that actually our number is probably a little bit high.
Yeah.
And so, is 30 the right number of destinations? I think that you could potentially narrow it down further to get the number lower. And I think that's an exercise that I'll leave to everyone else to figure out how you might do that. You could say, okay, well, if we say that actually of this 30, some percentage are overlapping, overlapping destinations, what percentage are overlapping destinations? You can make an assumption here, say, hey, 50% of these unique destinations are overlapping because, 12 airports per state seems kind of crazy. You could really, now we're getting less fast, but we're getting, I'm going to draw my crappy United States here, but you start drawing, 500-mile radius circles and 1,000-mile radius circles, and you say, okay, well, do you really need 30 unique destinations if from Atlanta you can reach 80% of the population? Probably not. So maybe what you do is say, okay, there's some percentage of overlapping destinations, and we say 50%. Now we've got 15, and now all of a sudden our number of commercial airports goes from 600. We've cut it in half to 300.
Okay.
So I think.
So you place them properly so that you need less and you can have more coverage area. So you basically place them in the center of 5 cities, or let's say 10 cities per airport, serving 100K each in this case, as an example.
Exactly. So that's the intuition that you would continue down that line. And actually, the real answer to your point, I think you actually get more fidelity. So I think that was Sumit, right? I think that intuition is absolutely right and gets you much closer to the real answer, which is to say, okay, I can take one further step and assume that I'm not going to place an airport in each city, but because people are willing to drive an hour or 2 hours, and they're like these kind of regional hubs, how far are each of these cities away from each other? How many airports are there going to be actually? And I think you can further refine it. Again, the prompt for me was really to get there as quickly as possible. And I think in this instance, you get there in roughly 4 steps. You kind of set a upper bound, set a power law, make a definition step of, unique destinations, and then cut that by 1, and you arrive in 4 steps that I think are really good answer. If you want to go further, you can actually do something like this, or something like Sumit said, to further get the answer to, I think, what is a more reasonable and in fact more accurate number of for the commercial airports.
All right. So what I want to do now, Ryan, thank you so much. This is a great answer. There's several people, I think, in this forum, in this meetup, that are also very interested in how to approach the problem. And so I want to use my board and work with you, Ryan, okay, to put the framework, okay? So when we are in that interview and we're asked the estimation question, let's put the step-by-step process so that people can actually use something that is a repeatable framework. Does that sound good?
That sounds good.
All right, so I'm gonna switch the camera to me.
I had sorry, this is Sumit, a different Sumit. So I had a comment. So this is one approach that that you can do, and this is the premise of this approach is basically that 100,000 population, right? And then this power curve that that Ryan has showed. Now, I think not everyone would be aware of this approach. So how about if we take a more generalistic approach, which I think goes by the population. I think doing it by population makes more sense. But doing a sense check, let's say okay, so New York, which has about 12 million population, has 3 airports, 2 or 3 airports, right? So that's the high end, right? The other is the other major city that I know is San Francisco, which has about 800,000 population, but it has around 3 airports in the vicinity. So if we do a sense check between these 2 cities, would do we think we take about 5, let's say on an average there's 1 airport for every 500,000?
Yeah, I think that's another approach. So I think I would say the metro area yeah, so you could absolutely say, hey, I know that there are 3 airports in the San Francisco area. I think there are actually 4 in New York, maybe even 5. But that's exactly what I would suggest if we actually think about how we would approach this. You would want to start with what you know. And I think you've just said, hey, I know exactly, like I know how many airports are in New York, how many airports are in San Francisco. I know how many, I know exactly how many people there are in each of those cities. And so can we assume that there's a roughly even distribution of airports across those populations? I think that's a perfectly good starting point. And that will get you to an answer. So there's no wrong way to begin this problem. You could say, hey, I live in Cincinnati and there's 1 airport here and there's that many population. And that's going to give you that's going to be an anchor. I think the next step around the estimation was to figure out how can you actually refine that estimation to make it more accurate and more realistic and to the point where you feel confident having that answer with sort of backing up that answer to the interviewer.
Okay. I think that somebody had a question, which is, how would they assume 30 unique destinations? That's Chandeep. Can you answer that, Ryan?
Yeah, so when I said that there are 1,000 cities, I assumed that those unique cities had, those airports had unique, those cities had unique airports. And so what I then said was, okay, I happen to know from industry structure that the airline is a hub and spoke system. And I estimated that there are 20 hubs. And then I said, how can we sense check that 50, if there are 20 hubs and every destination can be reached from a hub, which is again, that sort of logical step there because of the hub and spoke system. How many airports, how many destinations can you reach from each hub? That number turns out to be 50. And I thought about that number, and I'm actually not unhappy with that number. I can imagine, roughly 50 destinations. But then I thought about, well, when I actually look at a board at a New York or a Houston or a San Francisco, there probably are 50 destinations, but there are things that we want to throw out of there. We want to throw out international destinations. Those aren't really relevant to the US. And then I also realized that there are actually hub to hub. So these are interconnected with each other. So for every single hub, which I estimated there are 20, I just made a blanket assumption that each hub would fly to each other hub. Is that a great assumption? It's not perfect, but it actually turns out to be pretty good. And so what I did was I subtracted these from these 50 destinations, which I thought were unique. I then took down our total number of airports to say now it's actually 19, but I simplified the math to 20 and said, okay, we are taking this out and we're saying now there are only 30 unique destinations at each of the 20 hubs. So we multiply those back together to get 600.
All right, thank you, Ryan. That's a great answer. So let's go back. Can everybody see my whiteboard? Can you see it, Ryan?
Yes, we can.
I need to switch my screen, but I think I can. Here we go. Yes, I can.
All right, Ryan. So I want to work with you on this one. And, just to put a framework for people to learn how to do these questions. And we go again into the meat of how you solved it, Ryan. So basically, the first part is clarifying. That's something that Ryan did. You want to clarify what you need to count in your estimation. And Ryan, I think one of the questions that you asked me was to confirm that this was People's Airport. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, any other question that you can think of, or that would be enough?
I think that for me, when I said sort of the commercial airports in the US, I immediately thought that if you can buy a ticket online to go to a destination, that's really enough to count it as a commercial airport. Mm-hmm. So I didn't really think of any other questions. I'm open to the community here if you guys can think of any clarifying questions. I typically like to dig in.
That seems reasonable, unless somebody else had another question that that you would ask here.
Yep.
All right. So then the next step is like, okay, now this is the crucial part, right? So obviously, Ryan, you thought about it. You and I did this, right? So you came here already warmed up, right? But imagine that you are there, you haven't seen this question, right? What's your thought process for how to come up with your equation, Ryan? I know your brain is making relationships, but tell us how you would think about it.
Yeah, so I always want to start with what I know, something that I know. And how can I use what I know to bring insight or clarity into this problem? And the way that I showed it was, how can I, create error bars?
You create what?
Error bars.
Okay.
If I think about, I am 100% confident that there are more than 10 airports, even before starting this in the US. I've flown to probably 50 airports in the US. So I know that there are more than 50, right? I'm thinking about that. I happen to travel a lot, but you might start out at, 10. And then again, I think about the top range of that. That's how I started. So I know that I'm, 100% confident that the number is between, 10 or 50 in this case. And what's the smallest airport I can think of? And I turned out to be my hometown, but it could be anything. The smallest airport you can think of.
When you're thinking about largest or smallest, you're thinking in terms of population?
Yeah, in terms of population, right.
Top range. Okay, so it's really, it could be confusing this, right? It's not top range, you're thinking about, because what you're thinking first, I think what you were thinking first is like, there's a relationship between the size of a population or the size of a city and the number of airports. Isn't that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so first you think about relationship, which is, okay, let's put it there. There's a size of city in terms of population and number of airports.
Yes.
That's
actually a good point.
Right?
Yeah, that's actually a good point. Yep.
Okay, so that's what you think first. And then you were thinking, how can I put a bound on this, right? Is there a max? Your thought was like, what's the minimum size for one airport, right? For a population, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think at this point I'm thinking about, how will I satisfy, how will I get to a reasonable range that I'm confident in? And I think that that's my goal. I set up a goal here and I say, okay, I'd like to be, 95% sure that my error bars contain the right number or something like that. And so what I'm doing before what you said is actually just, okay, how can I, barbell this thing, or how can I kind of bookend the answer and then progressively whittle it down? That's my sort of algorithm, if you will. That's my approach. And so everything else that follows is trying to further improve my confidence in my answer.
So when you say barbell, is there a way to say this? Let's see, how can I?
Yeah, I mean, I take this from like a measurement book, which is, you want to have some degree of confidence in your answer.
Right.
And if you were to take a bet, again, I think of it in terms of bets, and I would say, I will bet you $1 million there's more than one airport in the United States. I would bet you $1 million that there are less than 3,250 airports. Okay. Now, as soon as I get to 600, do I feel like betting, $1 million? No, I couldn't, one way or another, I don't feel that confident. So at that point, I kind of stop. So I really want to increase my confidence to a point where, additional information from my head is not really adding any information to the problem. And I know that's really abstract, but again, I think about what level, how confident can I become in my answer?
I think,
And
but you're talking about confidence in the size, basically, of your hypothesis here. So
right,
size
yep,
and number of airports. Okay, so you say, okay, so think of like, okay, so this relationship. So you put a hypothesis there, or you put a statement, right? And you want to be confident of that statement. You will know that you're confident, right? What is, I would say, what is the relationship here that you feel 100% confident? Is that correct?
yeah. I mean, maybe not say that 100%, but I'd say that there's some 80% or something like that. It's if you're going to use that kind of term, where do I feel 80% confident? Consulting and PMing is often about 80-20. What I might be wrong 1 in 5 times,
What
but
do
I
you,
don't want to be.
I think it's like, what do you know for sure?
Yeah, that's kind of what I set up front. So what do I know for sure?
About
Yeah.
Okay, so, and okay, so 100K people,
Mm-hmm.
and proportional to 1 airport. That's what you're short of.
I know that's possible.
Possible. Okay.
Exactly. Right. So I know that there's a possibility. I don't know. What I don't know is of any airport that's less than 100K.
Okay.
And so
Now,
that's a possible.
the other thing I thought you did to get to your log distribution is like,
Yeah.
well, then you said, well, there is no uniform distribution, right, of population versus airport. So that's
Right.
You have to bring here now. What are things that you know, right? So sort of like
Yep.
things you know.
Right.
So distribution of population.
Yep.
Not regular, not uniform.
Yep.
In anywhere.
Yep.
In a country. Okay. So, and the other thing is that that the log is the best distributor, the closest distribution is the log.
Yeah, I think a lot of things actually, as I mentioned, power laws end up being very powerful for these kinds of questions because lots of unconstrained things like downloads, streams, shares, hits on music, words in a book, they all follow these power law. They all follow these kind of log distributions. So
right.
It's very good to be familiar with that distribution.
That's awesome. And so then you started thinking, okay, so I think that we have 100K people,
Mm-hmm.
right? 100K people, and then you say, okay, excuse me, you started with New York, I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe
Yep.
10 million people, and maybe
Mm-hmm.
that's a city like that, right?
Yep.
All right, and then you started going down, and I think that, you and I started this, which is a little bit simpler, but you said 100, is it 100K?
Well, we did. So we did, and then
then
we did so we did 1 million. What we did was 1 million.
1 million.
I said, look, I know that there are about 10 cities, and I think about the top 10 cities, and I can name them again. And then I say, okay, well, that so far seems to actually be pretty good. Yep, 500K, there's 100, and then 100K, there's 1,000. I tweaked the math again here to really be a smoother curve. I can't necessarily think of a function that's gonna give you that, but yeah.
But I'm sure if this is in the real interview, this is what we would put because you are in the moment, right?
Great.
And I think we optimize this to what you did today.
Yep.
But if we put ourselves in the shoes of because you did this in 5 minutes, Ryan.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
You were doing this, right?
Yep.
And that basically is the key answer to this question. because now you were saying, okay, so, I think we have 1,000 cities, with at least 100K people, right?
Yeah.
And so that's about 1,000 airports, right? More or less.
Right.
I mean,
more or less.
airports.
Yep.
And then you start thinking, well, okay, so now let me sanity check, right? And you start saying, okay, so let me think about the United States. And,
Yep.
oh, well, there are hubs here, right? And the assumption here is, you have maybe 20 hubs.
Yep. And I actually think this one matters less, because I think other people had really good intuition on how to think about the sort of number of airports, or the sort of the population. And if you say, hey, there are 100, there are 100 cities, 100K cities, but actually, I think they cluster, 5 cities cluster in a regional airport. You can make all sorts of different assumptions that you can make based on distance from an airport, or here's where your creativity comes in terms of what you know.
And the person before, I don't remember, somebody
To meet
different sanity check. What was the sanity check again?
So sanity check is primarily, what I mentioned was, if we have, let's say one city is, let's say, connected to 10 other cities, and people from those 10 cities can travel at least 1 hour, we can probably service 10 cities using the same airport. That is one form of sanity check. And while you guys were talking, I was thinking about another sanity check. With the COVID situation, I see the population number on the media is around 2.5 to 3 million travelers flying every day. So I can use that as a data set to see how many people flew per airport, and based on how many people can sit in a plane on average, with the average fill rate. And you try to do that as a sanity check too, as a second check. So just a thought.
This is the first sanity check that you mentioned. So one city is connected to 10 cities, and that tells you what?
So maybe that means for 600 cities, I can have 60 airports.
For 600 cities?
I can have 60 airports. Yeah.
So for 1,000 cities in this case, right?
Yeah, for 1,000
Yeah,
cities.
so you can have 100 airports. Exactly.
Yeah.
You have 100 airports.
Yep, and that actually tends closer to the answer. I think that you would probably end up revising that upwards, because there are certain cities where that doesn't hold true. But I think more often than not, that does hold true. And again, if you said 5 cities, maybe you get a little bit closer to the real number, but it doesn't really matter here, because I think, anywhere between 100 and 1,000, and you're on the right order of magnitude for the estimation. And you have a really good, I think you have a pretty good answer.
But the sanity check is here, okay, have 1,000 cities, you have 100 airports, so it's like, it would be like 10 cities will have 1 airport.
Yeah, it's the same case as in Bay Area. We have San Francisco, San Mateo, all these 10, 11 cities, they get served on the northern part from SF Airport, and southern part, Alameda County, and all these guys get serviced by the San Jose Airport.
Yep. So I think that's another example of using what you know. You say, I live in San Francisco. I can think of all the trains on the all the stops on the Caltrain. How many stops are there? There's probably, I don't know, is it 15, 12 that are stops. I actually don't know. And if I assume each one of those has kind of a city, or each 2 of those have a city, how many airports are there? There's 2. You get anywhere between 5 and 10 airports served by a metro, by those 2 airports. And so that actually really helps you. Again, that helps you nail that down even further. And again, I wouldn't overthink it. My core advice here is to get to something that seems reasonable. Anytime I did these, I think your second thing of, doing a load factor on a plane and then sort of averaging the number of passengers, if you happen to know that, great. I actually don't know what the sort of total passenger rate of airports is. I wouldn't expect anyone to, and that actually gets relatively complex. But if you can think of a simple way like that, it's a very powerful way to cut this down to size.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because this is I think the 50% of the question.
Yeah.
It's really important that people come up with ways to actually provide sanity check to themselves. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. So basically, you start with thinking about, okay, what's the relationship that can give me, that number that I'm looking for in terms of the number of airports. Well, I know the size of the city relative to how many airports there are, and now I'll come up with a way to actually do this across the country, right, with a log power, a power log here, or log, and then do the sanity check. Yeah, it's pretty good. I think I'm going to stop now, and maybe people have more questions for Ryan.
Yeah, and feel free to reach out to me. I know Chandeep actually asked in the chat how we got sort of to 600. I think what Sumit was saying was that we had actually arrived at this. We said that there are 20 duplicates between these hubs and arrived at 600 unique airports. But then if we assumed that these 600 were then condensed by a factor of 10, because each 10 of these unique cities had one airport as opposed to one airport per 10 cities as opposed to one airport per one city. That's why I said it was 600 as opposed to 1,000.
Right.
So I was also thinking of another approach to this while we were discussing this. So with this estimation approach is based on the population and the relationship between the population versus the airport, like number of airports, right? So we are starting off with assumption saying that 100,000 or 200,000 population would be served by one airport, let's say, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other assumption that we could start with is, for example, let's say the distance between the width of the country, right? The distance between Boston and which is the East Coast, and SF, which is the West Coast, two extreme points on the East Coast and the West Coast. The distance is probably around 3,000 miles, right? And then also estimate what the total area of US would be, and then how much area would you generally cover with one particular airport, because it has to be population and area wise. So we could either go by population or we could either go by area wise, right? The distribution of the airports based on the area that you cover with one airport.
So yeah, I think you can absolutely do that, and folks, I unfortunately have to go because it's relatively late, and I'm interviewing tomorrow. I'm happy to talk with anybody, but I think just to cover the area point, I actually drew that out here. It turns out that Atlanta is the busiest airport in the world and serves, it covers, I think, something like 50% of the area, or something like 60 or 70% of the US population within 1,000 miles. And so the only thing that I would caution you is that you might find, if you take that approach, you get planes can fly a long way. So if you're thinking about a plane can fly halfway across the world, and so it doesn't necessarily become apparent why you need planes per area, because they can cover the entire 3,000.
No. So not the planes per area. I'm saying airports per area, because a certain airport is covering a certain mile radius in terms of covering the population, right? So even though let's say Virgin Island, example of Virgin Island, right?
Yeah.
Which is probably not the right example, but let's say somewhere in North Dakota, there might be population which is so it is sparsely populated as compared to New York or California, but then you won't have the population residing in North Dakota drive down to, you know, somewhere middle of the country to actually get on a plane, right? So you would basically cover a certain amount of distance, certain amount of area with one particular airport. And that's where that's the assumption that, you know, I'm driving through this approach. That, hey, like, this is the area we probably cover, let's say 100 square miles with the.
I think that we probably need to take this offline. And
Sure.
Ryan, you know, I want to thank Ryan really for your time and really your knowledge. I think we learned a lot from you today. And you know, I think Ryan, you're open to get Submit's question. Is that okay?
Yeah, I'm happy if anyone has questions about the approach, or, you know, wants to learn more about estimation, or just wants to chat. I found this service valuable. You know, I found this community valuable. So really happy to chat. Unfortunately, I do need to run, but I really appreciate it, Melina. And thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ryan.
Send me
All
email.
right, thanks, everyone.
It's Ryan's email. Okay. Bye, guys.